The whiskey glass shattered against the saloon floor 2 seconds after Kate Reed said it, and the silence that followed swallowed the entire room whole. She had not meant for anyone to hear her. She had pressed her lips close to the rough-hewn bar top, her chin nearly resting on the sticky wood, her voice so low it should have dissolved into the sawdust and cigarette smoke, and the stale reek of men who worked too hard and bathed too rarely. But Lionel Turner had been standing right there, his broad shoulder not 6 inches from her bowed head, his whiskey glass halfway to his mouth, and he heard every single word she breathed into the bar. "Nobody has ever made me feel welcome here," she whispered. The glass had not been his that shattered. It belonged to Hank Dorset, the town's self-appointed moral compass, who had knocked it off the counter in his haste to step away from her, as though her loneliness were a contagious disease he might catch if he stood too close. Hank muttered something under his breath, something that included the word widow and something else that included the word trouble, and he moved to the far end of the bar without looking back. The piano stopped. Someone coughed. 3 men near the door exchanged glances that carried entire conversations in them, conversations full of suspicion and dark curiosity, and the particular cruelty of people who decided long ago that a woman like Kate Reed did not belong in a town like Redhaven, Texas, in the summer of 1878. She kept her eyes down. She had learned to keep her eyes down. But Lionel Turner set his glass on the bar very slowly, very deliberately, and he did not move away. He stayed where he was, that shoulder still within arm's reach, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned just slightly, just enough to angle his body toward her rather than away, and he said in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of something genuine, "Then let me be the first." Kate Reed lifted her eyes and looked at him for the first time in what felt like her entire life, and something inside her that had been locked away for a very long time turned over like a sleeping animal stirring toward warmth. She did not know then that she was looking at the beginning of everything. She did not know that the dark past she carried like a stone tied around her neck was about to become something she could finally put down. She did not know that the secrets Lionel Turner carried, the hidden motives the town suspected him of and whispered about in dry goods stores and church pews, would before long become the most important truth she had ever been trusted with. She only knew that he stayed. When every other person in that room had pulled away from her, he had stayed. And for Kate Reed, who had not been stayed for in a very long time, that was the most terrifying and beautiful thing in the world. To understand why that moment cracked her open the way it did, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the morning the stage coach rattled into Redhaven with Kate Reed inside it and a trunk of worn dresses on top of it, and understand exactly what kind of trap she was walking into without knowing it was a trap at all. She had come from Abilene with 2 things, a letter and a lie. The letter was real enough. It was from a man named Gerald Pratt, a cattle rancher of some standing in Redhaven, who had placed an advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle seeking a wife of sound temperament, modest bearing, and willingness to work. Kate had answered it because she was 26 years old and alone in a way that had grown very heavy, and because Gerald Pratt's letter back to her had been kind in its language, almost gentle, and because Abilene had nothing left for her except the grave of a mother and the memory of a husband who had died of fever 2 years before. Leaving her with nothing but that trunk and those worn dresses, and a name that people in Abilene whispered about in the wake of some scandal she had never fully understood the shape of. The lie was simpler. She had told herself she was brave enough for this. Redhaven in the summer of 1878 was a town of approximately 400 souls stretched along a single main street in the wide flat country of West Texas, where the sky went on forever, and the heat was a physical presence that leaned against you all day long. There was a bank, a general store, a church, a blacksmith, a stable, a school with 12 students, a doctor who drank too much, a sheriff who did not drink enough to soften the hard edges of his suspicion, and the Horseshoe Saloon, which was the center of all social commerce whether the church ladies admitted it or not. Gerald Pratt met her stage with his hat in his hands and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was 53, which she had not expected. His letter had not mentioned his age with any specificity, and she had formed in her imagination a man perhaps in his early 40s. Gerald Pratt was weathered and broad and not unkind looking, but there was something around his mouth, a tightness that did not ease when he smiled, that told her immediately that the gentleness in his letter was a performance he had prepared for paper, and not necessarily one he intended to sustain in person. He had introduced her to his foreman, a mean-eyed man named Dale Cutter, and to his housekeeper, a silent Mexican woman named Rosaria who communicated entirely in tight nods, and then he had brought her to the ranch house and shown her a room that was clean but bare, and told her that the wedding would be in 2 weeks, and that she should make herself useful in the meantime. That was the whole of his warmth. In the following days, Kate had accompanied Gerald into town twice for supplies and once for Sunday church service, and she had understood very quickly the dynamics of Redhaven's social architecture. The town had decided about her before she arrived. Gerald Pratt was a founding family name, his father having been among the first settlers of the region, and the women of the established families had already formed their opinion of a woman who answered a newspaper advertisement from Abilene, with a reputation that Gerald's nosy sister Margaret had made a point of investigating and sharing, loudly, at the ladies' auxiliary meeting the week before Kate's arrival. The rumor that had followed Kate out of Abilene was this: that her first husband, Daniel Reed, had not died entirely of natural fever, and that there had been questions that were never fully answered, about what exactly had been in the medicine she brought him in those final days. It was a vile and baseless rumor, the kind that grew up around a woman who was alone and not attached to a powerful man, and who was therefore available as a target for anyone's dark imagination. Kate knew the truth of it with every cell of her body. She had loved Daniel Reed with everything she had. She had sat beside his sickbed for 19 days without sleeping properly. She had held his hand when he died, and she had buried him in the hard Kansas soil, and she had wept until she thought the weeping would kill her too. But the rumor had followed her to Redhaven on Margaret Pratt's busy tongue, and so when Kate walked into the church or the general store, or, on one desperate afternoon, the Horseshoe Saloon to ask for a glass of water because the heat was blinding and she had walked into town alone, because Gerald had refused to take her that day, the people of Redhaven looked at her with that particular mixture of fascination and distance that people reserve for someone they have already convicted in the court of their collective imagination. She sat at the bar of the Horseshoe that afternoon, and Hank Dorset had knocked his glass away from her, and the piano had stopped, and the whole room had pulled back, and that was when she had pressed her lips to the bar and whispered the thing she had been carrying since she arrived. "Nobody has ever made me feel welcome here." And Lionel Turner had stayed. Lionel Turner was 31 years old and had come to Redhaven 8 months before Kate, arriving on horseback with a bedroll and 2 saddlebags, and a quiet manner that people in small towns either trust immediately or distrust absolutely, with no middle ground. Redhaven had chosen the latter. He had bought a small piece of land outside town, 3 miles east along the creek, and he had built a modest house on it with his own hands, and started a small breeding operation with 4 horses that he had brought with him and 2 more he had purchased locally. He was not a man who explained himself. He came to town for supplies and for the occasional evening at the Horseshoe, where he drank moderately and spoke rarely and listened always. He had a way of being present in a room without demanding anything from it, which some people found restful and other people found deeply suspicious. Sheriff Walt Briggs found it deeply suspicious. Walt Briggs was a man of 50 who had been sheriff of Redhaven for 9 years and who operated primarily on instinct. And his instinct about Lionel Turner had been formed on the second day after Lionel's arrival, when Walt had ridden out to the new man's land and asked him directly where he had come from and what his business was. Lionel had answered both questions truthfully. He had come from Missouri, and his business was horse breeding. But he had answered in the way of a man who was accustomed to answering only what was asked and nothing more. And Walt Briggs had read that economy of information as concealment, and had never fully revised his opinion. The truth about Lionel Turner's dark past, the one Walt suspected and the town embroidered with invention, was real but not what anyone imagined. He had come from Missouri in the aftermath of a forced choice that still lived in his chest like a splinter too deep to pull. He had been a lawman himself once, a deputy in the town of Claiborne, Missouri, and he had been good at it, quietly good in the way that good lawmen often are, the ones who solve problems before they become violence rather than after. But in Claiborne there had been a man named Jonas Webb, a man of power and connection, and a hidden motive that Lionel had uncovered slowly and at great personal cost. And the ultimatum Jonas Webb had delivered to Lionel had been the kind that stripped a man of everything: his badge, his home, his reputation, and nearly his life. Jonas Webb had accused Lionel of corruption publicly and loudly, and with manufactured evidence. And because Jonas Webb owned half of Claiborne, including the judge, the accusation had stuck long enough to burn everything to the ground. Lionel had not been convicted of anything, the evidence too obviously fabricated to hold even in a corrupt courtroom, but he had been driven out by the weight of suspicion, and he had driven himself out further than necessary because staying in Missouri felt like trying to breathe in a room that had used up all its air. He had not told anyone this in Redhaven. It was his history to carry, and he carried it without complaint, but it had made him careful about trust in the way that betrayal always makes a person careful, which read to outsiders as coldness and to Sheriff Walt Briggs as guilt. So when Kate Reed came to Redhaven and Lionel Turner was the one man in the Horseshoe Saloon who did not step away from her, the town observed this and added it to their ledger of suspicions about him. Birds of a feather, Hank Dorset told his wife that evening. Trouble finds trouble, but Kate did not know any of Lionel's history that afternoon. She only knew that he had offered her a glass of water from the bar, that he had sat down on the stool beside her as naturally as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and that he had asked her, without any particular preamble, whether she had seen the creek east of town yet, because it was the best thing about Redhaven in his opinion, and she looked like a person who could use something good. She had looked at him then, truly looked, and registered him properly for the first time. He was a tall man, lean without being spare, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were watching her with an attention that was serious without being predatory, the kind of attention that comes from genuine interest rather than calculation. His hands on the bar were steady and were cruffined, and he wore no gun at the hip, which was notable in Redhaven where even the schoolteacher went armed. "I haven't been anywhere much," she said carefully, because in Redhaven she had learned to be careful with everything she said, except the ranch and the church and here. "That's a very thin picture of a place," he said. "I know it. The creek has cottonwood trees," he said, "big ones. They've been there a long time. There's something settled about them." She had not expected that. Men in her experience, men in the West of 1878, did not often speak about the settled feeling of trees. She looked at him more carefully. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked, because she was too tired and too wrung out to be anything but direct. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you look like a person who came here with hope and found something different instead," he said. "And because I know what that feels like." That was the whole of their first real conversation. He walked her to the edge of town before they parted, because the sun was going low, and he did not like the idea of her walking the road to the Pratt Ranch alone in the gathering dark, and he did it in a way that was matter-of-fact and undemanding, as though escorting her to the edge of safety was simply something a person did for another person, no drama and no debt implied. She thought about him for 3 days afterward and told herself firmly to stop. Gerald Pratt noticed her distraction, though he did not know its source, and he responded to it in the way of a man whose primary mode of communication was authority. He increased her workload and reminded her twice in one evening that the wedding date was fixed and that he expected her to be ready. When she asked, gently, whether they might perhaps delay slightly and spend more time getting to know each other before the ceremony, he looked at her with those eyes that never quite warmed and said that he had made all the necessary arrangements and that second thoughts were a luxury he did not have time for. That night she sat on the edge of the bare bed in the bare room and thought very carefully about the trap she was in. She had traveled 200 miles. She had no money of any significance. She had no one in Redhaven who would act as any kind of advocate for her. She had a reputation in Abilene that made going back there a kind of defeat that would be difficult to survive with any dignity. And Gerald Pratt, who was not the gentle man of his letters, had her effectively cornered in his house with his foreman and his silent housekeeper as the only witnesses to her situation. She thought about Lionel Turner's gray eyes and the way he had said, "I know what that feels like," without making it about himself, and she pressed the thought down firmly because it was the kind of thought that could become a dependency. And Kate Reed had survived 2 years of loss and slander by being careful about dependencies. She met him again 4 days later at the general store, where she had been sent to collect supplies for the ranch. He was buying grain and a length of rope, and a new bridle that he was examining with the focused attention of a man who knew horses well, checking the stitching at the bit rings with his thumb. He saw her come in and nodded in that way he had, as though her presence were something natural and expected rather than something to be managed. Old Clarence Dodd behind the counter watched them with the alert interest of a man who sold information as freely as goods, and Kate kept her voice pleasant and neutral when she greeted Lionel, which she could tell amused him slightly. "How is the ranch?" he asked, carrying his grain to the counter. "Large," she said. "How is Mr. Pratt?" There was a pause in which she weighed her words against Clarence Dodd's open ears. "He is well," she said. Lionel looked at her for just a moment with those gray eyes that did not miss much, and she saw him register what she was not saying, and she saw him decide not to press it, which was exactly the right thing to do in front of Clarence Dodd, and she felt unreasonably grateful for his intelligence. They ended up walking out together with their respective supplies, him loading his grain into his saddlebags at the hitching post while she organized her basket, and in the ordinary privacy of the open street, which was not really private at all but felt freer than Clarence Dodd's counter, she said quietly, "The wedding is in 10 days. He settled a saddlebag and looked at her. "Are you glad about that?" "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest answer she had given to anyone since arriving in Redhaven. "What do you know?" he asked. She looked down the main street of Redhaven, at the church at one end and the sheriff's office at the other, and the rows of buildings between them that had been built by people who had decided this was the place, that this flat, hot, wide-sky country was where their lives would be, and she thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the difference between them felt like. "I know I want to stay in Texas," she said slowly. "I know I don't want to go back to Abilene. I know I'm very tired of being afraid of what people think of me." "Those are good things to know," he said. "They don't give me a great many choices," she said. "They might give you more than you think," he said, and he said it carefully, as though he were handing her something fragile and wanted to make sure she had a proper grip on it before he let go. She thought about those words for 10 days. She thought about them while she helped Rosaria in the kitchen, and while she aired out the linens Gerald expected her to manage, and while she sat in the church on Sunday, and felt the women around her making a careful, measured distance between their bodies and hers. She thought about them while Gerald Pratt looked at her across the dinner table with those calculating eyes and spoke about the ranch in the possessive plural, "our cattle, our land," as though the marriage had already occurred and she were already absorbed into his inventory. On the 7th day before the wedding, Dale Cutter, Gerald's foreman, found her alone in the barn feeding the horses and stood in the doorway in a way that blocked the light and most of her exit, and told her that she should understand something clearly. Gerald Pratt was not a man who released what he considered his. He said it pleasantly, almost helpfully, as though he were offering useful travel advice, but the shape of it was a threat and they both knew it. She walked past him without answering, because her voice had gone somewhere she couldn't find it, and she walked back to the house and sat in the bare room and shook for a while, and then stopped shaking through sheer determination and thought about what options she had. The following afternoon she walked to town alone, which Gerald had not given her permission to do, and she found Lionel Turner at the Horseshoe in the early afternoon, which is where she had hoped she might find him, and she sat down across from him at the table in the corner where he always sat, and she said, keeping her voice very level, "I need to talk to someone who is not trying to benefit from my situation." He set down his coffee, which was what he drank in the early afternoon, and looked at her steadily. "Then talk," he said. So she did. She told him about Dale Cutter in the barn. She told him about the way Gerald's gentleness had evaporated the moment she arrived. She told him about the letter and the advertisement and the hope she had carried from Abilene and the different things she had found here. She did not cry, because she was past the point where crying felt like it would do anything useful, but her voice had a quality to it that she could not entirely control, a compressed, careful tightness that told its own story. Lionel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer premature solutions or reassurances that would have been hollow. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You don't have to marry him." "I understand that in principle," she said. "No, I mean practically," he said. "You have options. There is nothing in Texas law that compels you to go through with a wedding you don't want. Gerald Pratt is a man of standing in this town, which makes it harder but not impossible." "I have nowhere to go," she said. "That's the part you think is the problem," he said. "But the real problem is you've been convinced that his version of your situation is the only version. It isn't." She stared at him. "What would you have me do?" He thought about this seriously. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over, run by a woman named Ada Fleming. She is a practical person who doesn't traffic in gossip because she considers it a waste of time. She has rooms. I could speak to her on your behalf if you wanted. And Gerald Pratt is a bully who operates through social pressure and the assumption that women have no alternatives," Lionel said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was very quiet and very certain. "Men like that depend on that assumption being true. The moment it stops being true, they lose most of their power. He could make things very difficult for me here," she said. "He already is," Lionel said simply. She sat with that for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him, the same question she had asked in this same saloon the day they properly met. "I am not your problem." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and something moved in them that was not calculation and not performance and not the angled sympathy of a man pursuing his own advantage. "No," he said. "You're not my problem. You're a person sitting across from me in real trouble, and I have the ability to help, and that seems like enough reason." She decided to trust him. It was not a decision she made lightly. Trust had cost her before in ways that had left marks. But there was something about Lionel Turner, the consistency of him, the way he was the same in every encounter, that felt like bedrock rather than performance. She told Gerald Pratt that evening that she would not be marrying him. She said it at the dinner table because she had learned that Gerald performed better in front of an audience, even the audience of Rosaria clearing plates, than he did in private where there was no one to observe his reasonableness. She said it clearly and without apology. She had reconsidered, she was declining the arrangement, and she would be moving to town the following morning. The silence at the table was very long. Gerald Pratt's face went through several colors before settling on a controlled red that was more frightening than the uncontrolled version would have been. He said very quietly that she should think carefully about what she was doing. He said that her reputation in Abilene had preceded her to Redhaven, and that without his name she would be nobody in this town. He said that she was making a mistake she would not be able to correct. She said, "I understand," and went to the bare room and put everything she owned into her trunk, and the following morning she walked to town with her trunk and she did not look back. Ada Fleming was indeed a practical woman. She was 58 years old and had been widowed 3 times, the first 2 by misfortune and the third by relief, as she mentioned once without elaboration, and she ran her boarding house with the calm efficiency of someone who had long ago taken the full measure of human nature, and found it neither surprising nor particularly alarming. She gave Kate a room at a rate Kate could manage with the small amount of money she had, and she told Kate that she was welcome to earn part of her board by helping with the cooking, which was work Kate was entirely capable of doing, and which gave her a reason to be useful, which she needed more than she would have wanted to admit. The town reacted to Kate's departure from the Pratt Ranch with exactly the mixture of fascination and judgment she had anticipated. Margaret Pratt made sure that the version of events circulating in Redhaven included the information that Kate had been impossible and ungrateful, and had probably only come to Redhaven for money to begin with. Gerald, to his credit in the purely social sense, did not publicly make a spectacle of the rejection, which told Kate that his pride was larger than his anger, and that he preferred to manage the story rather than have the story manage him. But the social distance around Kate increased. She was now not just a suspected widow from Abilene, but a woman who had rejected a founding family name, which in Redhaven's hierarchy of offenses was nearly criminal. She found herself, in those first weeks at Ada's, more alone than she had been even at the Pratt Ranch, because at least at the ranch there had been the daily structure of tasks to fill the hours. In town she had the cooking at Ada's, which occupied the mornings, and then the long afternoons in which she was ostensibly free but practically imprisoned by the lack of social access that would have made freedom feel like anything other than exposure. She walked. She walked the streets of Redhaven in the afternoons, telling herself she was getting to know the town, and she endured the looks and the slight movements of bodies away from her, and the conversations that stopped and started again in her wake, and she thought very hard about whether this was survivable. Lionel Turner came to Ada's boarding house on her 4th day there. He came in the early evening and asked Ada if Miss Reed might have a visitor, which was the proper form, and Ada assessed him with the kind of rapid and comprehensive accuracy that a woman who has observed human beings for 58 years develops as a survival tool, and apparently reached a satisfactory conclusion, because she brought Kate to the sitting room. He had brought her a book. It was a copy of a novel, a slightly battered, well-traveled copy of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, the kind of book that had been read multiple times by multiple hands. He set it on the table between them with no ceremony, and said he had thought she might want something to read in the evenings. She looked at the book and then looked at him and felt something in her chest do something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not a large thing, not a dramatic revelation, just a small and quiet shift, like a window opening in a room that had been closed too long. "Thank you," she said. "How are you finding it here?" he asked. "At Ada's, I mean." "Better," she said. "Ada is kind, not demonstratively but genuinely." "That's the best kind," he said. They talked for an hour. They talked about books, about which neither of them had any shortage of opinions. They talked about Texas, which Kate was still making her peace with, and he told her things about the landscape that made it comprehensible to her in a way that simple exposure had not, the names of the plants and what the creek looked like in different seasons, and the way the light worked in that flat country at certain times of day. He had a gift for describing things precisely without making the description feel like a lecture, and she found herself listening not just to the information, but to the way he organized it, the way his mind worked. He came back 3 days later, and then 3 days after that, and Ada observed these visits with the same comprehensive accuracy she brought to all human behavior and said nothing except, once, when Kate was helping with dinner, "He's a man who means what he says and says what he means. They're rarer than they should be." Kate tried not to build on that observation too quickly. But the visits continued, and something was building regardless of her caution, something constructed from the specific texture of his attention, and the way he listened to her, as though what she said mattered not because she was saying it to him, but because it was worth listening to, and the way he had begun to look at her in those moments when he thought she was not watching, a look that was not hidden but was quiet, the kind of look that knows it has no right to demand anything and is content to simply exist. She asked him one evening, 6 weeks after she had arrived in Redhaven and 4 weeks after she had left the Pratt Ranch, about Claiborne. She did not know about Claiborne then, but she had heard something. A fragment passed through Ada from the general social circulation, something about Missouri and something about a question over Lionel's past that the sheriff kept alive and occasionally aired in public. "There is a story about you that goes around," she said. "I thought you should know that I've heard parts of it." He looked at her without evasion. "What parts?" "That you left Missouri under a cloud. That something happened there that you won't talk about." He was quiet for a moment. That was not the quiet of someone building a lie, but the quiet of someone deciding how much truth to give and where to begin. "I was a deputy in a town called Claiborne," he said, "and I discovered that the most powerful man in that town was running a land theft operation against homesteaders, mostly families who had come out of nothing to build something and didn't have the legal sophistication to recognize that their land titles were being manipulated. I built a case. I thought I had enough." He paused. "Jonah's web had more. He turned it on me before I could use it. Manufactured evidence, bought testimony, the whole architecture of a man who has been protecting himself for years and knows exactly how to do it." "He drove you out," she said. "He drove me out," Lionel confirmed. Not with conviction, because even his bought judge couldn't quite manage that, but with enough damage to the name that staying in Missouri was not a life I could build. "And you came here." "And I came here," he said, "and I have been here long enough to have given this town no legitimate reason to suspect me of anything, but Walt Briggs decided about me in the first week and has not revisited the decision." "People decide about me too," she said. "I know they do," he said. "The rumor from Abilene," she said, "about Daniel." He met her eyes directly. "I don't believe it." The simplicity of that stopped her. "Why not?" "Because I've been watching you for 6 weeks," he said, and now there was nothing held back in his voice, just the plain statement of something true, and a person who could harm someone they loved does not exist in your face. She felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. She pressed her hands together in her lap and breathed carefully. "I loved Daniel very much," she said. "He died of fever. I was with him every hour of every day of it. I would have traded places with him without a second thought." "I know," he said. "How can you know?" she asked. "The way you speak about him," he said simply. "There's grief there, real grief, the kind that leaves a permanent shape in a person, not the grief of someone who has a secret." She looked at him for a long moment in the quiet sitting room of Ada Fleming's boarding house, while outside the sounds of Redhaven's evening settled around the building. The distant music from the Horseshoe, the footsteps on the boardwalk, the creak of wagons, the ordinary texture of a town going about its ordinary life without any awareness of what was happening in this room. "You are a remarkable person," she said softly. He shook his head slightly. "I'm a reasonably observant one," he said. "No," she said. "You are genuinely good, Lionel. And I think that people who are genuinely good are often the ones who get the most punished for it, because they refuse to be otherwise even when it costs them." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something pass across his face that was not quite pain but was related to it, the acknowledgement of something true that had cost him to carry. "That is a generous way to describe stubbornness," he said, but his voice was not entirely steady when he said it. She smiled then, and it was not a careful smile, not the managed, self-protective smile she had been using as social armor since her arrival in Redhaven, but a real one, open and warm, and she saw his expression change when he saw it, something releasing in it like a held breath finally let go. The trouble came from Gerald Pratt 2 weeks later, which she had known it would and had been bracing for, though the specific form of it was worse than she had expected. Gerald had gone to Sheriff Walt Briggs with a formal complaint. Not about Kate, not directly, but about Lionel Turner, whom Gerald had decided was the architect of Kate's refusal of the wedding, and whom Gerald now accused, in a conversation that became public faster than anyone comfortable with ordinary privacy would have liked, of having improper influence over an unmarried woman and possibly of motivations connected to his mysterious history in Missouri. Walt Briggs, who had been waiting for a legitimate excuse to investigate Lionel more aggressively, took this complaint with an enthusiasm that had very little to do with its actual merit. He came to Ada's boarding house on a Tuesday morning with his deputy at his side and his badge prominent on his vest, and he asked to speak with Kate Reed, and Ada Fleming allowed it with the specific quality of permission that communicates complete awareness of what is actually being done and complete unwillingness to cooperate with it beyond the minimum the law required. Kate sat in the sitting room and listened to Walt Briggs explain, in the formal language of official inquiry, that he had concerns about her association with Lionel Turner, and that in the interest of her own well-being, he was advising her to be careful. He said this with an expression of authority that was meant to communicate care but communicated the opposite of it, and Kate sat with her hands folded and her face quiet and asked him whether she was being charged with anything. He said no. She asked whether Lionel Turner was being charged with anything. He said not at present, which was meant to be threatening. "Then I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of this visit is, Sheriff," she said. "Unless it is to deliver a message from Gerald Pratt, in which case I should tell you that I have received the message, and that my answer is the same as it was the day I left the ranch." Walt Briggs left without having accomplished what he came for, but his visit had the intended secondary effect. It gave the town fresh material, and renewed the conversation about Kate Reed and Lionel Turner in terms that were both unfair and difficult to argue against publicly. Lionel heard about the visit the same afternoon, through the kind of rapid information circulation that small towns perform as a kind of civic exercise, and he came to Ada's that evening with a gravity about him that was different from his usual composed quietness. "I am sorry," he said, when they were seated in the sitting room. "This is because of me. Because he knows that helping you is the one thing he can use against me. It's not your fault that Gerald Pratt is a vindictive man," she said. "No, but it's a complication for you that I could have avoided if I had been less." He stopped. "Less what?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "If I had stayed in my own lane," he said, "as people here would prefer." "Is that what you want to do?" she asked. "Stay in your own lane?" The question landed in the space between them with a weight that was larger than its words, and they both knew it. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees, his gray eyes on hers with an intensity that had been building for weeks and was no longer making any attempt at concealment. "No," he said, "that is not what I want, but I don't have the right to want something that puts you in a more difficult position than you're already in." "What if I don't care about the difficult position?" she said. "You should care," he said, "practically speaking. You are a woman alone in a town that has already made up its mind about you. Any association with me makes that harder. Any association with you," she said, "is the only thing in Redhaven that has made any of this feel worth surviving." The room was very quiet. He said after a long moment, "Kate, don't tell me to be sensible," she said. "I have been very sensible. I have been sensible about everything since Daniel died, and it has given me a reputation I didn't earn and a failed engagement to a man who saw me as inventory and a room in a boarding house in a town that would prefer I disappeared." She paused. "You are the one person who has looked at me like I'm a full human being and not a problem to be managed, and I am not going to pretend that does not matter to me." He was on his feet before she finished speaking, not dramatically but with the contained, purposeful movement of a man who has made a decision after very careful consideration and is now moving through it. He crossed the small sitting room in 2 steps and sat down beside her on the settee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he took her hand in both of his with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size and roughness of those hands. "It matters to me too," he said, "considerably." She looked down at her hand in his and then up at his face, which was very close now, and she felt the accumulated weight of every lonely day in Redhaven and every dark night in Abilene after Daniel died lifting away from her like something physical, like a garment she had been wearing too long in too much heat. "Considerably," she said. "Enormously," he corrected, and the word came out roughened at the edges in a way that made her breath go shallow. He kissed her then, or she kissed him, or they met somewhere in the middle with equal intention, and it was not a tentative or experimental kiss, but a very certain one, the kind that does not ask questions because the question has already been answered, and Kate felt something inside her that had been held shut for 2 years open fully and without reservation, like those cottonwood trees along the creek that he had described in their first conversation. Settled and deep-rooted, and entirely at home where they stood. They pulled back after a moment, and Ada Fleming's footsteps were audible in the kitchen, and Kate laughed slightly, and Lionel's smile was the kind she had not seen from him before, uninhibited and warm, and it transformed his face in a way that made her want to find every opportunity to produce it again. "Ada is going to have opinions," Kate said. "Ada already has opinions," he said. "She has had them for some time." He was right. When Lionel left that evening and Kate helped Ada clear the supper things, Ada said, without preamble or ceremony, "He'll do," and then began washing up with the focused efficiency of a woman who considered the matter settled. Gerald Pratt's campaign against them did not end with Walt Briggs's visit. The following week, Margaret Pratt made a formal complaint to the Ladies' Auxiliary that Kate Reed was compromising the moral standing of the town, and that something should be done, which resulted in a delegation of 3 women appearing at Ada's door, led by a woman named Sylvia Croft, who was tall and precise, and had the particular confidence of a person who has never seriously had their social position threatened. Ada Fleming met them at the door and told them, with absolute pleasantness and no room for negotiation whatsoever, that her boarding house was a private residence and that she did not receive delegations, and closed the door. Kate, who had been watching from the top of the stairs, came down and found Ada already back at her ironing with the expression of a woman who has done what needed doing and feels no need to discuss it further. "Thank you," Kate said. "Women who do that kind of thing," Ada said, pressing her iron firmly to a shirt collar, "have nothing better to do with their energy, and that is the kindest interpretation." The social pressure did not break Kate, but it was exhausting in the way that sustained unkindness is always exhausting, not because any individual incident is catastrophic, but because the accumulation of small exclusions and cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when she walked into a room added up to a constant low-grade state of siege. She told Lionel about it one afternoon when he came to ride with her along the creek, which had become their habit several times a week, the 2 of them on horses side by side in the wide Texas landscape, where there were no watching eyes and no social performances required. "I know it will not change overnight," she said, watching the creek run over its stones. "I know towns are slow to revise. I just want to understand what the shape of my life here looks like in 5 years. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. The cottonwood trees were everything he had promised them to be, large and old and settled, their leaves turning in the slight breeze off the water with a restful sound. "I have been thinking about that too," he said. She looked at him. "Have you?" "Specifically," he said, with a carefulness that was the particular carefulness of a man approaching something important, "I have been thinking about what would change for you in terms of the town's dynamics if your situation were different, if you had a different kind of standing here." "What kind of standing?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. The kind that comes with being married, he said. Not in the way Gerald Pratt meant it as a management of property, but as a genuine partnership. Between two people who, he stopped and looked at her directly and dropped the careful phrasing entirely. I want to marry you, Kate. Not because it would solve your social problem, though it might help with that, but because I cannot imagine the shape of my future without you in it, and because you are the most honest and courageous person I have met in a very long time, and I would consider it the great good fortune of my life to spend it with you. The creek ran over its stones. The cottonwood leaves turned in the breeze. Kate looked at this man who had stayed when everyone else had stepped away, who had brought her a book and walked her to the edge of safety, and listened to her speak Daniel's name without flinching, who carried his own history of betrayal and forced choice without letting it make him bitter, who looked at her like she was a full human being and not a problem to be managed. Yes, she said. He turned to look at her, and the smile came, that uninhibited, warm smile, and she thought she could look at that smile every day for the rest of her life and never find it anything other than wonderful. They rode back along the creek in the late afternoon light, which was doing the thing he had described in one of their first conversations, the thing the light did in flat country at certain times of day, going golden and enormous, and painting everything in the warm tones of a world that had decided to be generous. And Kate felt something she had not felt in 2 years, the specific physical sensation of being at home in her own life. They set the date 6 weeks out, which gave time for the proper arrangements, and also, Kate suspected, gave the town time to acclimatize to the reality before it became the official fact. Ada Fleming immediately became the practical architect of the event with a brisk competence that suggested she had been waiting for this assignment, since approximately the third time Lionel Turner had appeared at her door. The announcement had the expected effect on the town's social landscape. Gerald Pratt received the news with a stiff public composure that cost him visibly, and said nothing beyond what was required of a man in his position when something happened that he had not authorized. Margaret Pratt was less composed and more vocal, which produced the opposite of her intended result, because Margaret, at full volume on the subject of Kate Reed's unworthiness, struck several women in town, women who had not previously had strong opinions, as excessive in a way that made them reconsider their received wisdom about Kate. Walt Briggs cornered Lionel outside the stable the week after the announcement and told him, with a bluntness that was at least more honest than his previous formal visit, that he had better not find any reason to look at Lionel's past more closely, which was a threat and an acknowledgment in equal measure, and which Lionel received with the calm of a man who no longer has anything in his past worth hiding from, and said simply that Walt was welcome to look wherever he liked. The wedding was small because they wanted it small, not because they were ashamed, but because the people Kate wanted to share it with were few and specific. Ada Fleming. The Reverend Hartwell, who was a quieter and less politically managed man than his congregation sometimes wished, and who had made a point of calling on Kate twice at the boarding house with what seemed like genuine pastoral interest rather than social surveillance. A young woman named Clara Binns, who worked at the laundry, and who had been quietly kind to Kate from almost the beginning, in the easy, undemonstrative way of someone who had learned that gestures cost nothing and matter more than people think. And a man named Samuel Briggs, who was Walt Briggs's son, and who shared his father's name and almost none of his father's disposition, who had been Lionel's occasional company at the Horseshoe for the past several months in the easy way of two people who enjoyed each other's conversation, without requiring anything from it. Sam had come to the ranch one afternoon and introduced himself to Kate with a directness and a warmth that she had been surprised by, and said that he thought his father was wrong about Lionel and wrong about her, which he had told his father directly, and which had not changed Walt's position, but had at least prevented it from hardening further. The morning of the wedding was a bright, clear Texas morning in mid-September of 1878, with a sky the color of washed blue and a temperature that was finally beginning to ease off the brutal summer heat. Kate stood in her room at Ada's and looked at herself in the small mirror and thought about Daniel, as she had known she would, and let herself be sad for a moment, and then let the sadness settle into the permanent, honoring grief it had become, the kind that coexisted with everything else rather than crowding it out. She wore her best dress, which was pale blue, and Ada had found flowers somewhere, the small yellow wildflowers that grew along the creek, and twisted them into a simple arrangement that she pinned at Kate's waist without comment. The ceremony itself was at the church, and they had not made an announcement about the time, but Redhaven was too small for it to be truly private. And when Kate walked to the church with Ada on one side and Clara Binns on the other, there were people on the boardwalk watching. Some watched with the cool assessment of observers recording data. Some watched with the barely contained satisfaction of people who preferred their social prejudices confirmed. But some, more than Kate had expected, watched with something that was closer to simple human warmth, and two women she did not know well nodded at her as she passed with expressions that acknowledged her without performance, and she found she was grateful for it in a way that surprised her. Lionel was waiting at the front of the church with Sam Briggs beside him and the Reverend Hartwell between them, and when Kate came through the door and started down the aisle, she watched his face change with a fullness of feeling that was entirely unguarded, as though he had not prepared to see her walk toward him, and the reality of it had caught him without his composure in place, and she loved him for it profoundly. The ceremony was simple, and the words were the old words, the words that had been said in every church and open field and candle-lit room since people decided to make formal the thing they felt for each other. And when Reverend Hartwell asked Lionel whether he took this woman, Lionel looked at Kate the entire time he said yes, as though the answer were addressed not to the Reverend or the institution or even to God but to her, directly and personally and without intermediary. Kate said her own yes, and felt the word move through her like something becoming true on both the inside and the outside simultaneously. They ate the wedding supper at Ada's, 6 people at a table laid with Ada's good cloth, and the food was excellent and the conversation was easy and warm. And at some point in the evening Kate looked around the table and felt something she had been longing for since before she could fully articulate it. The specific sensation of being among people who were genuinely glad she was there. They went to Lionel's house that night, her house now, 3 miles east along the creek, and the house was simple and plain and had been built with care, and the creek was audible through the open window in the bedroom. And Kate stood at that window in the dark and listened to the water and felt the entire weight of the past 2 years, Abilene and Daniel and the rumors and Gerald Pratt, and the cold eyes of Redhaven, settle into something she could carry without being crushed by it. Lionel came to stand beside her at the window, and they stood together for a long time listening to the creek and saying nothing, which was its own kind of conversation. And Kate thought that this was what she had been looking for when she answered Gerald Pratt's advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle. Not this house specifically and not this man by name, but this. The particular quality of not being alone in the fullest sense of the word, the sense that includes being truly seen and genuinely chosen rather than simply needed or convenient. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was very afraid," she said. "When I got here and then when I left the ranch and then when I was living at Ada's with the whole town deciding about me, I was more afraid than I showed." "I know," he said gently. "I didn't want to be afraid in front of you," she said. "I thought it might make you see me differently." He turned slightly toward her in the dark. "It would have made me see you more clearly," he said. "Not differently, more clearly." "I will try to remember that," she said. "Fear isn't weakness," he said. "It's just information. What you do with it is the part that matters." She turned to look at him, his profile against the dark window, and thought that he had arrived at this understanding the hard way, through Claiborne and Jonah's Web and the forced choice that had cost him his badge and his home and his name in Missouri, and that wisdom purchased at that cost was worth something particular. "What you do with it," she said softly, "is stay." He turned and looked at her, and in his expression was everything she needed to see. The weeks that followed were the business of building a life, which is both smaller and larger than it sounds. Kate learned the house and the land and the horses, whose names she insisted on knowing immediately, and who she approached with the patient confidence of a woman who had grown up around animals and had not been frightened of them since she was 7. Lionel learned that she cooked better than he did, which she used as leverage with entirely benign intentions, and that she had a reading habit that matched his own, which meant evenings by the lamp were among their best hours. She began to work with Ada Fleming again, not for board now, but because Ada had let it be known that she could use reliable help with the cooking and the management of her 3 boarders, and the income was useful, and the company was easy. This meant that Kate came into town 3 days a week, and as the weeks passed, the social temperature of Redhaven shifted in small increments in ways that were not dramatic and would not have made a newspaper headline, but that Kate noticed and marked with an interior registry. The woman named Laura Haverstock, who had been part of the ladies' auxiliary delegation that Ada had turned away from the door, stopped Kate on the street in October and said, with a stiffness that was the residue of someone walking back a position they have held publicly, that she hoped Kate was settling well. It was not an apology and it was not warmth, but it was an acknowledgment of her presence as a legitimate citizen of Redhaven, and Kate accepted it without making anything of it, which she could see relieved Laura Haverstock considerably. Clara Binns became a genuine friend, the kind of friend women in small towns in the west of 1878 needed and were lucky to find, the kind with whom the social performance could be put down, and the real conversation picked up, and they spent an afternoon a week together when Kate's schedule allowed, drinking coffee at Ada's and talking about books and the town and the particular quality of life in flat country, and occasionally about men, which always produced its best conversation. By November, Kate was pregnant. She knew it before she told Lionel, carried the knowledge for 3 days while she worked out what she felt about it, which was more complicated than simple happiness only because she had been alone for so long and had learned to be careful about things she wanted very much, in case they were taken back. But the wanting was there, enormous and warm, and on the 4th day she told him at breakfast, with the directness that was the register in which she and Lionel naturally communicated, and the way his face opened with pure undisguised joy was the moment at which her carefulness about this particular wanting dissolved entirely. "Are you glad?" he asked, and she could see him asking because he wanted her gladness confirmed, not because he doubted it, but because her gladness was the thing that mattered most to him. "I am so glad," she said. "I am completely and genuinely glad." He came around the table and held her, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heart, which was steady and sure, and thought that this was what steadiness felt like from the inside. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold by Texas standards, which meant manageable by Kansas standards, and Kate worked the horses with Lionel in the mornings, while the cold held and read in the afternoons, and made the house into something increasingly her own in the accumulation of small choices. A curtain here, a particular arrangement of the books on the shelf, the way she managed the kitchen garden that she had started planning against the coming spring. All of it the slow, quiet work of belonging somewhere, which she had not done since before Daniel died, and which she had forgotten was possible. She went into Redhaven in February of 1879 for a winter social at Ada's, a small thing Ada organized every February as a concession to the tedium of winter, and she walked in, and something had changed in the room in a way she registered immediately. Several women who had not spoken to her since her arrival looked up when she came in and smiled, not with the performance of social courtesy, but with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at her presence. A woman she knew only by name, Mrs. Abilene Voss, crossed the room to ask her how she was feeling in the pregnancy, and expressed such uncomplicated human interest that Kate was moved in a way that was slightly embarrassing and entirely understandable. After walking home through the cold night, she told Lionel about it, and he listened with the attention he always gave her and said, "Towns change slowly, but they change." "Do you think they'll always see you with Walt Briggs's eyes?" she asked. He considered this honestly. "Some of them will. But fewer than before, I think. And most of them have stopped looking at me the way they look at a man with something to hide, which is an improvement." Indeed it was. Through the winter and into the spring, the dynamics of Redhaven continued their slow revision. Gerald Pratt had begun pursuing a woman from the county seat, which occupied his attention and his ego in ways that reduced the energy he had available for maintaining hostility toward Kate, and Margaret Pratt, without her brother's active resentment, as fuel, had less to say about the Turners than she once had. Walt Briggs remained suspicious of Lionel in the abstract, the way some people maintain old positions as a matter of pride rather than evidence. But Sam Briggs had become a genuine and regular presence at the Turner Ranch, helping with the horses on weekends in exchange for lessons in the breeding work that he had decided he wanted to learn. And even Walt could not sustain a full campaign of suspicion against a man his son admired. In April of 1879, Kate Turner nee Reed delivered a son. He arrived in the early morning with Ada Fleming and the Redhaven doctor, who had reduced his drinking to levels that made him professionally functional again, both present, and he was healthy and loud about his opinions from his first breath, which Kate considered an excellent character trait. They named him Daniel, for the man she had loved and lost, and when she told Lionel she wanted that name, he had said yes immediately, without hesitation, as though it were the only natural answer, and she had loved him for it in a way she still could not find the exact words for, the way that love sometimes exceeds language. Daniel Turner was 3 weeks old the first time Gerald Pratt walked past Kate on the main street of Redhaven and tipped his hat to her. It was a small thing, the minimum social courtesy, but it was more than he had managed in the previous 8 months, and Kate received it with a nod and kept walking, and felt the last weight of that particular chapter settle into the past where it belonged. The spring of 1879 was exceptional, as Texas springs sometimes are, the kind that arrive with a generosity that almost apologizes for the brutality of summer to come. The land around the Turner Ranch came into color in the way that flat country does, not the vertical drama of mountains but a horizontal abundance, wildflowers running along the creek bank, and the cottonwoods putting out their new leaves in that particular young green that is almost luminous. And Kate rode out with Lionel on a morning in late April with Daniel in a basket arrangement. She had rigged to the saddle in the way women on the frontier managed to solve every practical problem the frontier presented, and she showed Daniel the cottonwood trees she had been hearing about since before she knew what they meant to her life. "Your father told me about these trees when I had only just arrived," she told the baby, who was not yet tracking objects with any reliability but who seemed attentive to her voice in the way that all babies are attentive to their mother's voice. "He said there was something settled about them." "Still true," Lionel said from beside her. "Still true," she agreed. She looked at him in the spring morning light, this man who had stayed when the whole room had pulled away, who had offered her a glass of water and a settled view of cottonwood trees, and the plain and sufficient reason that she was a person in need, and he had the ability to help, who had matched her betrayal with his own and her loneliness with his own, and out of the convergence of those two separate silences, had made something that was neither silent nor lonely. "I want to tell you something," she said, which is what she had said on their wedding night, and he recognized it and turned to look at her. "Tell me," he said, which is what he had said then. "I'm happy," she said. "I mean it fully. I am properly, completely, without qualification happy. I didn't know I would be able to say that again." He looked at her for a long moment, and the morning was golden around them, and the creek ran over its stones, and Daniel made a small sound that was the sound of a baby deciding everything was satisfactory. "I know," Lionel said quietly. "So am I." The summer of 1879 brought the horse breeding operation to its first real commercial success. 3 of their colts selling at prices that confirmed the quality of the program and established Lionel's reputation with ranchers in the county as a man who knew his work. Sam Briggs had become genuinely skilled with the horses under Lionel's instruction and spent more time at the ranch than in town, which had the secondary effect of Walt Briggs coming out to collect his son one afternoon and spending 2 hours watching Lionel work with a young stallion and saying nothing complimentary but also, for the first time, nothing hostile. Kate had taken to writing, not for publication but for the practice of it, recording the particulars of the life she was building, the seasons of the creek and the character of the horses, and the ongoing human drama of Redhaven that was from her new position both more distant and more comprehensible than it had been when she was standing in the middle of it without any stable ground underfoot. She filled a journal and then another one, and Lionel read what she gave him without commentary except once, when he said that she wrote the way she talked, which was direct and true and occasionally devastating, and that she should consider more. She considered it. By the autumn of 1879, the social position of the Turners in Redhaven had shifted enough that, when the annual harvest social was organized, and the ladies of the planning committee discussed who should bring what, Kate Turner was asked to bring her apple cake, which was famous in the particular way that good food becomes famous in small communities, by universal testimony. She brought the cake and stood in the social hall of the church with Lionel and Daniel, who was 6 months old and being passed from arm to arm by women who a year ago had carried their social distance from Kate like a point of principle. And she looked around the room and thought about the shape of belonging, how it rarely came as a formal announcement or a dramatic reversal, but in these accumulations of small inclusions, the request for a recipe, the genuine question about the baby's sleeping habits, the nod of acknowledgement from a woman who had once led a delegation to Ada's door. Ada Fleming, standing beside Kate with a cup of cider, looked around the room with her comprehensive assessment and said, "The town has come around." "Mostly," Kate said. "Mostly is all you ever get," Ada said. "Entirely is a fiction." Clara Binns, on Kate's other side, laughed, and Kate laughed too, and it was the uncomplicated laughter of a woman who no longer had anything to be afraid of in a room. Gerald Pratt was at the social with his county seat woman on his arm, and he crossed paths with Kate near the punch table, and they exchanged brief pleasantries with the civil neutrality of people who had decided that the only dignified way forward was through rather than around. And Kate thought afterward that it was the first time she had spoken to Gerald Pratt without any residue of fear or bitterness, just the mild interest one has in the resolved parts of one's history. In the early spring of 1880, Kate discovered she was pregnant again. She told Lionel the same way she had told him the first time, at breakfast directly, and his joy was the same as it had been the first time, immediate and unguarded, and she felt the same dissolution of whatever residual carefulness she had been maintaining about the things she wanted most. Daniel was 11 months old and pulling himself along the furniture with magnificent determination, and what appeared to be specific opinions about which objects were worth his attention, and he expressed these opinions loudly and clearly, which Kate and Lionel agreed was an excellent foundation for a full human personality. That spring also brought a visitor to Redhaven who changed the final remaining dynamic that had been outstanding in their lives. A federal circuit judge named Harlan Moore, who was making the rounds of the West Texas counties in the course of official business, arrived in Redhaven for 2 days and stayed 3 because Ada's cooking was exceptional. Sam Briggs, who had been reading law in his spare time with quiet ambition, attached himself to the judge with the eager intelligence of a young man who has found his direction, and Judge Moore was sufficiently impressed to suggest Sam present himself at the federal court in Austin within the year. This was all interesting but secondary to what the judge brought with him in his saddlebag, a legal document that had been circulating through Missouri federal records and had finally been properly acted on. Jonas Webb of Claiborne, Missouri, had been formally indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of land fraud and conspiracy, based on evidence that had been painstakingly reconstructed by a successor investigation that had picked up where Lionel's original case had been interrupted. The indictment included, in its documentation, a formal acknowledgement that the previous accusations against one Deputy Lionel Turner had been manufactured and were without merit. Judge Moore had not known Lionel was in Redhaven until Sam Briggs mentioned him in conversation, at which point the judge had asked some questions and made some connections, and arrived at the Turner Ranch on his last morning in Redhaven with the document in hand and a straightforwardness about it that Kate had immediately liked. Lionel held the document for a long time and said nothing. Kate sat beside him at the table and watched him read it twice and felt the quality of the silence around him change as he read, the specific quality of a silence in which something that has been held tightly is finally being released, the relief and the grief mixed together in the way they always are when a long injustice is finally, inadequately addressed. "It doesn't give you back what you lost," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But it is true," she said. "On paper now, the truth that was always true." He looked up from the document. His gray eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. "Yes," he said, "it is." He put the document in the box where he kept the papers that mattered, and Kate thought about what it meant for a man to have carried a forced accusation for 3 years across 1,000 miles of country, and built an entire new life in its wake, and never lost himself in the bitterness of it. And she thought that this was perhaps the deepest thing she understood about who Lionel Turner was, that his character had not been formed by what had been done to him, but by what he had refused to become in response. She told him this that evening, sitting on the porch in the spring air with the creek audible in the dark and Daniel asleep inside, and he listened the way he always listened, fully and without preparation for his reply, and when she finished he took her hand and said, "You are better at understanding me than I am." "That's usually how it works," she said. "I suppose it is," he said. They sat on the porch in the spring dark and listened to the creek, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And the stars over West Texas were extraordinary in the way that stars in flat country always are, the sky too big to hold only darkness. And Kate thought about the night she had come to Redhaven on the stage with her trunk and her letter and her lie about being brave enough, and the woman she had been that night, and the woman she was now. And the distance between them was not a year and a half of calendar time, but an entire life's worth of transformation, the kind that only happens when you allow the right person to show you what the right conditions feel like. She had told a bar top in the Horseshoe Saloon, in a voice not meant to be heard, that nobody had ever made her feel welcome here. And Lionel Turner had stayed longer, and in staying had changed everything. In October of 1880, Kate delivered their second child, a daughter this time, and they named her Ada, which made Ada Fleming say only that they had no sense, and then spend the following weekend out at the ranch rearranging the baby's room with focused and benevolent efficiency. Walt Briggs, who by this point had gradually, and without ever formally announcing it, begun to revise his position on Lionel Turner, came to call when the baby was 3 weeks old, which was not something he would have done a year previous, and he sat at the Turners' table and drank Kate's coffee, and held Ada with the careful hands of a man who has held babies before, and knows that their total confidence in you is either the most flattering thing in the world or the most terrifying, depending on your temperament, and said gruffly that Turner's colt had been the best horse he had seen in 3 years of looking, which was about as much of an accommodation to warmth as Walt Briggs was built for. And everyone in the room understood it for what it was. Sam Briggs had gone to Austin and come back with a position in the Federal Circuit Office and a greater clarity about the law and his place in it. And he rode out to the ranch whenever he was in Redhaven and sat with Lionel and talked about law and horses and the West with the ease of a genuine friendship that had its roots in the specific quality of two honest people having recognized each other across a room full of performance. The breeding operation expanded in 1881, a new barn going up in the spring with Sam's help, and a purchase of 2 more mares that Lionel had scouted carefully across 2 counties. And Kate began her 3rd pregnancy that summer with a steadiness and a joy that were by now fully integrated into who she was. A woman who had come to a place she was not welcome and made herself a home in it by the sheer sustained force of living honestly and choosing generously and refusing to be made small. She had begun writing more formally, not just journals but essays and pieces she sent to the Dallas Morning Herald, which had begun publication in 1885 but which she was planning for, building the habit of the writing that would eventually find its proper venue. And in the meantime, she read everything that reached the Redhaven General Store and wrote letters to Clara Binns about books and ideas that Clara saved in a box and later said she valued more than almost anything she owned. Clara had by this time married a man named Edward Hartwell, the Reverend's younger brother who had arrived in Redhaven the previous year, and this friendship between the 2 families, the Turners and the Hartwells, became one of the architectural features of both their lives. The Sunday suppers and the shared childcare of Clara's eventual children, alongside Kate's 3 and then 4. The conversations between Kate and Clara that ranged across everything and the quieter but equally substantive conversations between Lionel and Edward about the business of building something real in the West and the particular challenges and freedoms of that project. The 3rd Turner child, born in early 1882, was another boy, whom they named James, after Lionel's father in Missouri with whom he had reconnected by letter after the federal vindication of his name. James Turner Sr. had written a letter of such careful, measured pride and relief that Lionel had needed to be alone for a while after reading it, and Kate had given him the alone time without comment, and then found him at the creek later, standing under the cottonwood trees with his hands in his pockets and his face turned up to the sky, and she had come to stand beside him in the way they had learned to stand beside each other, not requiring anything, just present. By 1883, Redhaven had grown, as West Texas towns were growing in that period, the railroad having reached a point 30 miles to the south that brought commerce and connection, and new settlers in a steady influx that changed the character of the town in the gradual and irreversible way that development changes everything. New families, new businesses, a second school, a proper hotel that reduced Ada Fleming's boarding income somewhat, but which Ada accepted with philosophical equanimity, because she was more interested by that point in her grandchildren's visits than in her boarders. The Turners' ranch had grown proportionally, the horse breeding business having established a reputation that extended well beyond Redhaven County, with buyers coming from as far as San Antonio and once from New Mexico Territory. Lionel had taken on 2 hands, young men he hired with the same careful attention he brought to everything, looking for honesty and willingness to learn rather than flash or bravado, and the operation ran with the quietly efficient competence that characterized everything Lionel built. Kate's 4th pregnancy came in 1884, and this time she delivered a girl in the late spring of that year, and they named her Abilene, a name Kate had always liked for the way it sounded, and which Lionel agreed to immediately and then pointed out, as he pointed out most things, in the most straightforward and unmanipulative way possible, that Abilene was also Mrs. Abilene Voss's name, the woman who had been the first of the ladies' auxiliary set to genuinely soften toward Kate. And Kate thought about this and said she did not mind that at all. The summer of 1884, when Abilene was 3 months old and James was 2 and little Ada was 3.5 and Daniel was 5 and full of passionate opinions about everything. Kate stood at the window of the ranch house kitchen and watched Lionel come in from the barn with Daniel on his shoulders and James toddling behind him, with the intense concentration of a 2-year-old who has decided to be included in whatever is happening, and felt the weight of all the years since the Horseshoe Saloon gather into a single coherent understanding. She had come to Redhaven with a letter and a lie, and the lie had been right in the most important way. She had in fact been brave enough. Not in the way she had imagined, not the bravery of enduring a bad marriage or surviving a hostile town, but in the more difficult bravery of letting the right thing grow when the right thing appeared, of trusting a man who stayed when she had learned to expect everyone to step away. Lionel came through the door with Daniel ducking under the frame and James arriving breathless at his father's leg, and he looked at Kate standing at the kitchen window and saw whatever she was thinking on her face, and smiled with the fullness that she had been collecting and cataloging for 6 years now, every variation and texture of it, because it was one of the things she loved most in the world. "Something on your mind?" he asked, setting Daniel down. "A great many things," she said, "all of them good." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the window and looked out at the same afternoon she was looking at, the creek visible through the cottonwoods, the late summer light doing the thing it always did in flat country, golden and enormous and generous. And Daniel ran back out through the door into it, and James followed with his determined toddler urgency and the sounds of them, their voices and their footsteps and the particular live music of children who have no idea they are providing the evidence for all the arguments in favor of hope and continuation, filled the kitchen and the ranch house and the land around it. "I have been thinking," Kate said, "about the fact that I almost did not come here. After Daniel, after Abilene, there were many mornings when I thought it was too much to try again, that I should just stay where I was and be what I had become and ask no more of myself. But you came anyway," he said. "I came anyway," she said, with terrible judgment about which man to come for, but I came. "Gerald Pratt's worst quality," Lionel said, with the dry humor that had become one of her favorite things about him, "was that his advertisement brought you here." She laughed. "I will never tell him that." "Probably wise," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him fully. This man who had given her back the ability to believe that love was something that could be rebuilt after loss, that home was something that could be found after displacement, that a person who had been made to feel unwelcome in a place could, by patience and love and the refusal to be diminished, make themselves not just tolerated, but genuinely, warmly, irrevocably at home. "I want you to know," she said, "that everything good in my life since I came to Redhaven began the day you stayed." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him taking this in with the seriousness he gave to everything that mattered, not dismissing it with modesty and not magnifying it with sentiment, just receiving it as the true and simple statement it was. "I want you to know," he said, "that you have given me something I had stopped expecting to find. Not just the children and the life and the work of it, all of which I am grateful for beyond what I can say, but the specific feeling that who I am is enough. That the thing that drove me out of Missouri and made me careful and kept me quiet was not a flaw but a direction, pointing me here." She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, and he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm with a tenderness that was 6 years old and still new. The way real things remain new because they are being made rather than performed. Daniel's voice came floating back through the open door, calling for his father to come see something at the creek. The urgent discovery of a boy who has found a frog or a strange stone or the evidence of a beaver, and cannot imagine that anyone else would not immediately share his priority. And Lionel turned toward the door with the smile and the willingness and the genuine delight in his children that was one of the continuous confirmations for Kate that she had not simply been fortunate, but had been correctly, specifically, profoundly right. "Coming," he called back, and he took Kate's hand and they went out together into the late summer afternoon, into the golden flat country light, toward the cottonwood trees and the creek and the children who were theirs, toward the life they had built out of the particular materials of their separate courage and their shared capacity for love. And the Texas sky went on above them, enormous and clear and without limit, the way it does in flat country when there is nothing in the way of seeing it whole. Ada Fleming, who visited every Sunday without fail and who had outlasted 3 husbands and 1 grudge-bearing ladies' auxiliary, and the full tenure of 2 sheriffs including Walt Briggs, who had retired the previous year with Sam taking the badge in a ceremony that had been quietly one of the most satisfying days of Lionel's life, sat on the porch of the Turner Ranch that evening and held baby Abilene and watched Kate and Lionel and the older children move in the gathering dusk along the creek bank, and said to no one in particular, in the tone of a woman who has observed enough of human beings to know the real thing when it is in front of her, "That is what it looks like when it works." And it was. And the creek ran on through the cottonwoods, and the stars came out enormous over the flat country, and in the house that Lionel Turner had built with his own hands on the land he had come to in the aftermath of betrayal and driven injustice, the 4 children of Kate and Lionel Turner made the noise that health and safety and love make when they have enough room, and Kate Turner née Reed, who had whispered once into a sticky bar-top that nobody had ever made her feel welcome here, lay in the bed she shared with the man who had heard her and had stayed, and listened to the sound of everything she had come to be in this life, and felt, in the full and complete and unqualified meaning of the word, at home.